Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's REDAA webinar, tackling the power and politics of locally led nature restoration. My name is Janine Duffy, and I am part of the REDAA team here at IIED.
And my name's Francesca Booker, and I'm also part of the REDAA team here at IIED.
So very quickly, what are we going to explore today? So we're going to begin with a very brief overview of the REDAA programme. Then we'll introduce our speakers today. So we're joined by three of the REDAA partners, and we'll receive some opening comments on the webinar. We'll then hear from our first presenter speaker, who will explore external factors related to policy and power that affect locally led nature restoration. We'll then have a very short interactive exercise with you all. And then we'll move on to our second presenter, who will be speaking in relation to policy engagement to influence locally led nature restoration. And then we'll have time for a Q&A discussion. So just to begin with, what is REDAA? So the Reversing Environmental Degradation in Africa and Asia programme, or REDAA for short, is an FCDO-funded international development programme, and it's delivered in partnership with the International Institute for Environment and Development. So REDAA supports locally led research and action for nature restoration and climate resilience across 3 geographical regions, so Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia and Southeast Asia. And the programme offers grants and facilitates technical support and mutual learning through a community of practice.
Very briefly, REDAA has 3 main activities, and they are improving evidence on key ecosystems, such as their status related to degradation, restoration, and their contributions to people's livelihoods. Ultimately, what we want to see is actionable information that can improve restoration and management. The second activity is around applying and learning from new tools or technical approaches for environmental management, conservation, and restoration. And the third is around strengthening governance systems, including, for example, finance and support mechanisms, as well as supporting gender equitable and socially inclusive long-term decisions and actions. All of REDAA supported activities intend to support actions that are nature positive, strengthen local livelihoods, and tackle the impacts of climate change. REDAA is currently supporting 10 projects in Sub-Saharan Africa, 4 in South Asia and 7 in Southeast Asia. Today, we're joined by colleagues leading projects in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And our webinar today is hosted by members of the locally led nature restoration community of practice. This community of practice is for anyone with an interest in locally led nature restoration, no matter where you are in the world, no matter where you sit, whether you're a practitioner, a policymaker, a local champion, a researcher. This community is intended for you, and we welcome everyone. The intention of the community is to enable knowledge exchange and peer learning, to build and strengthen our networks together, to support capacity building and policy influencing opportunities, and to spread the use of new and effective evidence and tools. We're doing this through various means, including this webinar that we find ourselves on together today, and there'll be more throughout the year. And we collaborate to create knowledge and learning products. If you want to be part of the community, and we do encourage you to join us, all you need to do is sign up to our newsletter to hear about opportunities, and we'll drop a link in the chat. That's everything from me and Janine for now. So let me hand over to our conversation lead today, Anita Varghese. Anita, over to you.
Thanks, Janine, Matt, and Francesca. Thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you for inviting me to lead this conversation. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Anita Varghese. I'm one of the directors at Keystone Foundation, an NGO that's based in the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, which is part of the Western Ghats biodiversity hotspot in India. And here in these mountains, our own project, which is supported by REDAA, is to do with having indigenous people in mountain areas being at the center of community-led restoration projects. And when we're talking about ecological restoration in this landscape, it has a lot to do with forests and restoring forests, especially high elevation, wet and dry forests, and grasslands. So we're also talking about, forests that are not necessarily all about trees. And when I was asked to lead this conversation, I was really happy to be part of something it's very critical that we talk about the governance mechanisms in our restoration efforts. Restoration, it's the decade of ecological restoration. There's a lot of talk about it. I think as nations, as communities, as civil society, we're also talking about the fact that plantations are not necessarily restoration. And so there is an interest to get it right. But how right are we getting it about the governance aspect? Because that's very critical in these aspects of who makes the policy, who has the power to decide, who is shaping the nature of the current restoration efforts that are going on. And we all agree. We've all come to agree that restoration is somewhere at the key to affecting climate resilience, about loss of biodiversity, human well-being is at risk, and all of that is coming in the way of the larger goals of sustainable development. So this is a little bit of the backdrop, and about a little bit about what my motivation is. And I'm really happy to facilitate our two excellent speakers from Bangladesh, Dr. Tanzil and Dr. Lila Nath Sharma from Nepal. And, I think these conversations between us, between Nepal, Bangladesh, and India, and the lessons that we have will hopefully throw some light on what have been our successes, what have been our challenges when talking to power and policy, and how we've been managing this. So I don't want to take a lot of time on this, and I really want more time for Q&A, because we really look forward to the questions out there and the discussions. I'm really hoping to make this a very interactive webinar. And so without wasting more time, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Tanzil Shafique. Before I hand over to him, just quickly that I think it's also up there on the event page, but he's a lecturer at the University of Sheffield, comes from a background of architecture and urban planning. His restoration project is quite interesting because it deals with restoration in urban spaces. And Dr. Shafique is also part of several citizen movements on climate and just housing. So he has a very interesting background. So over to you, Tanzil, and we look forward to what you have for us today.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you.
I only have complications to share. But that's what talking about power and politics and sort of, all that you mentioned. I mean, it is how we actually go, share and learn from each other. So that's the core. And hopefully we can do that. So I titled it, the project I'll share, the one that I'm, leading, is called REWET, and I'll talk about it in a minute. And then you can see from the title, it says, Navigating Internal Frictions, Elite Barriers, and Bureaucratic Gridlock, and the Revolution. So pretty much everything that you can throw at it, at a project, we have, at least I feel we have encountered a lot of that. So these are some stories from there. So just a bit of a background about the project. So the project, the official title is Climate Impacted Dwellers-Led Agroecological Stewardship for Restoring Wetlands. And that hopefully that's one way of saying what the project is doing. It's very short. It's an urban wetland right in the middle of Dhaka city. And as you can see, it's bordered by one of the largest informal settlements, actually the largest informal settlement in Dhaka. And on the other side, it's actually the richest part of Dhaka. So this water body is ecologically dead. Everyone is dumping a lot of things that they shouldn't dump into the lake water. We wanted to restore it, working with the urban farmers who actually reside in the settlement. So we're working with Nogorabad, and Nogorabad is sort of that local entity based in Korail. The settlement is called Korail. So they're based in there, and they're our agroecological cooperative. So we're working with them to start some and lakeside greening activities, which help the water, like do like nature-based phytoremediation, and also some floating infrastructure, but all led by the local knowledge and the local expertise. So that's sort of like a brief background of the project. You can see the details there. I don't want to go into the details. Hopefully that makes sense in terms of the project, how it is. One key aspect of the project is we have youth climate activist groups as outreach partners. So it's a consortium of 8 organizations, which includes 3 universities, 2 implementation partners in Bangladesh, and then 2 NGOs, youth activist groups. So now, if I were to sort of, expand upon the often thought of myth that informal settlements are, rural migrants coming to cities, and, they're just slum dwellers who are living in the slum. You don't really get to see a lot of the agency in the way that it's operationalized. So this is a mapping of somewhat of the relations in Karail. And you can see in the lower half, it's the relations, within Karail as a settlement. So you can see that there are so many different socio-political, socio-economic groups, forms of agency and forms of subjectivity that's already there. So you have mosque committees, political party wings, NGO committees, the local bazaar, the market committees, savings groups. So they interact in many different ways. And then these are also interconnected and, through to the formal side of things. So, how they're linked with the police, the national political party, and even all the way to international donor agencies such as IAED and, EKF-CDO and the United Nations and stuff like that. So there are this governing relations that exist. So when we say that we're operating in Karail, we are operating in the situated relational space, and that's an important thing to understand, that we don't want to reduce the project by saying, oh, we're just working with few slum dwellers, because it's never just that. Talking about this complicated, we'll maybe move on to the next bit, and I'm happy to come back if there are questions regarding sort of the details of this. Yes. So, as I said, the first thing to consider is the local paradigm. So you can think of, I have 3 slides and I'll talk about it in the 3 different scales. One is sort of at the scale of the settlement itself, and the contests, the contestations that happen within the settlement. So for example, when we started working with Nogorabad, simply put, there were factions and groups who started coming. They were not interested in the lake edge before, but suddenly everyone became interested in the lake edge, and then they started saying, how come you get to do agriculture on the lake edge, and we don't? So, and suddenly everyone was interested in this, and then there was a lot of conflict in some ways, and this is, and sometimes this kind of what they can do to oppose the project is so trivial that it's very difficult. For example, they could come at night, and then we have some ongoing test beds of saplings. They can just remove the saplings at night, just as a way of causing a little bit of trouble. So there are all these hiccups that they can cause, which is not at a scale of shutting down operations, but this is at a very low scale, very small scale neighborhood, forms of contestations. So what we did is, there are many different many small things that we did. So of course there is ongoing, trying to understand the local power dynamics, who is behind sort of like who, and what is the desire, what they want to do, what they, what are they doing it for money? Are they doing it for power? Are they doing it? So they're understanding those things was important. The tactics that we used is to really bring together, stakeholders who are sitting slightly higher in the, let's say, the hierarchy of power there. So, we brought in some of the senior local leaders from the settlement. As you can see them in the photo, we can brought some, the higher official from the police. So in some way, we had some meetings trying to understand and trying to mediate. That's one tactic which seems to be working for now. But also what we kept doing is we wanted to keep saying that this is it's not an outside thing. It's a local initiative. It's your thing. It's your neighbors who are, the urban farmers. So this idea of a locally led, because oftentimes if they see the project as, oh, big money coming from outside, then they feel like they want to cash in. So we wanted to get out of that narrative of this is not an NGO project, this is not an outside project, it's a local project. And this also sort of helped navigate that power dynamics. And then, of course, the opportunities is, of course, establishing, we want Nagorabad to become fully operational as a cooperative, and then have a long-term governance structure that could be replicated. And then this idea of a community ownership and truly, how do we write ourselves out of the picture? Slowly, how does it become so locally embedded and well-resourced that they can start pulling in resources from other places, and they can sort of self-sustain this project beyond our 3-year, like 4-year frame. That's really the core at this, at this level of power dynamics. As I mentioned, we are bordered on the east by one of the richest, the elite neighborhood called Gulshan, and the challenges is one of the key challenges is we tried to do a lot of like local level stakeholder meetings, and it seems that the most difficult people to onboard into that are the community groups or the society that's called the Gulshan society. It's difficult to engage with this upper class, quote unquote upper class, elite neighbors. And then it seems like because they have a lot of financial independence, they seem not to care about being part of a consortium or being part in a sense that they can use money to get stuff done. So for example, they have some lakeside stewards, essentially like paying some people to take care of the lakeside on that side. But while it looks green from here, actually the edge itself is quite dead. They plant some really a species that does not make ecological sense. It's just about beautification, but it's difficult to have that conversation with them. And one of the issues is that it seems they are actually much less aware about the need for nature, biodiversity, but there is a higher need for, oh, does it look nice? Will it sort of like look nice from my house? So there is a different set of desire that operates, and this was surprising finding for us. So what we have tried to do is, to have like one-on-one meetings before inviting, meeting with the president of the society, and slowly maybe this is starting to shift. But again, as I said, this is much more difficult. One other tactic that I didn't mention here is there are some volunteers who live on this upper class neighborhood, and they also are interested in lakeside restoration. We have done an MOU with them, these local volunteers, and then we're trying to, have some stewards come from the not just from Karail, so that it doesn't look like that it's only slum dwellers who are doing. We're trying to blur that distinction through sort of like having a consortium of stewards who operate on the lake edge. So that's also one of the tactics being used. And then the tactic that we used is, we talked about in terms of the economic gain of the project because it seems like they're concerned about money a lot. So we tried talking about the project in terms of not just the biodiversity, but in terms of concrete economic gain. And we wrote op-eds and in the newspaper, sort of like English news dailies that is read by sort of the upper class. So that's also one way of getting into that sort of discursive space. Opportunities, of course, down the line, we feel that the support from there is actually not just about the finance, but also in terms of connections, in terms of what they can bring. A lot of them are like high NGO officials, working in embassies. So we feel that they can actually bring a lot of valuable connections that are global in scope, that will help the project sustain and draw in resources. So they are an important part if we can sort of like have them on board in a sustainable way. And then there is at the scale of, so at the national government and the municipal government, the challenges is we'll talk about the government instability in a bit, but it seems that of course there is much the way that Karail is run as a sort of like a polynuclear power distribution. The city itself is running like that. The city corporation doesn't really have a say on the lake itself because the lake is owned by the capital a capital planning agency. So the planning agency is different than the city corporation, which seems like just the management bit. And there are Department of Water and Sanitation who are in charge of the lake itself, but cleaning the lake, but because they say we don't own it, we're not going to clean it. So of course this very weird sort of like colonial hangover of having institutions that was designed in pre-independence Bangladesh, when we were part of the British colony, part of the Pakistan regime. So all these laws and sort of like lack of coordination by design actually hinders wetland restoration because no one has this sort of like a central ownership of the biodiversity and the wetlands. So, and the second problem is that the government agencies, even when we have them on board and they're interested, they don't have a language and a vernacular with which to speak about co-production with communities, because they might use the word participation in a very tokenistic way, but to really have this notion of a locally led, allowing slum dwellers to take decisions about the lake, brings in questions of, oh, are they squatters, and they don't even have the rights to be in the city, and all this sort of legalistic language often comes in a way that hinders this agency of the locally led, in the sense that people who live there, they already, by virtue of being a resident in the city, they have rights to the city, and all that discourse. So the tactics that we have used is sort of maintain strong relationship with both current and potential officials, and that's an important bit. So officials might change, and you have to also work with not, let's say, the chair, but also the deputy chair who will be the chair. So, and then, the person next to them. So it's about working with that entire chain rather than the top person. One thing that we felt really helped was bringing all this government, people into the site, making like site visits and tours, and allowing them to see for themselves rather than being, having these meetings in their own premises. So because when they literally see it and then they act, it has a larger impact than just reporting or just having and seeing it in screen. And opportunities, of course, I mean, if the way that we want to scale up at the scale of the Dhaka city, of course, at that point it really needs to be driven by the national government. So of course that's very important in terms of the opportunity. One particular issue is that politics sometimes is very based on party lines, and we want to sort of avoid that. And this is all sort of like the ordinary power dynamics, let's say, all these levels. And then we had sort of right after the REDA project started, we started in April. In July, there is a revolution. I'm not implying any causal relationship, but a government which actually was very, very autocratic in nature fell. Been in power for 16 years, they fell. There was a mass student uprising. The prime minister fled, and then this is actually the prime minister's office. And the next slide, you can see on the very far right, the new chief advisor, who is Dr. Mohammad Yunus, very well known in sort of like international development for running Grameen Bank, coming up with microcredit and operationalizing at a scale that is so and also Nobel laureate in 2006. So he, as you know, he was asked to be the interim head of the government, and then he sort of like constituted a new set of ministers, a new set of, so entirely the politics of the nation changed from sort of party lines to working with primarily people who were operating in NGO space and like civil society actors. And one thing that I'll say that out of complete luck, the project manager for our project, Azaz, who runs River and Delta Research Center, was tapped on the shoulder to be the mayor of Dhaka North. So you can see that's Dr. Mohammad Yunus and Azaz, sharing books or I don't know, giving some gift to the chief advisor there. And the very last bit is when Azaz became mayor, so he's no longer the project manager, we're recruiting a new one, but he is staying on board as an advisor to REWET. So he's very much still part of it, in-kind contribution. So the first day that he actually assumed the office of the mayor, the first meeting he had was with the Karail residents. You can see that in the picture. That's on the day that the mayoral inauguration happened, and he received the Nagorabad, the slum dwellers and the urban farmers.
Right.
And I just wanted to end on that note of
Thank you,
the locally
Tanzil.
led, how it can go forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanzil. I'm so sorry to keep cutting in like that. So but I think this is also because we want to make this an interactive webinar, and I hope there will be more time for questions, and we will get to say all the tons of things that are in the background that you can't necessarily tell in one presentation. And I thought it was very interesting. Some of the things that you brought up about the notion of outsider, local, and within the local, how local, and especially this challenge of working with people from, with education, good education and economic backgrounds. How do you make them care enough? And I thought, when we come back to the Q&A, I'd really like to hear a little bit more about how it worked for you to change this notion of, you talked about it, but what were those things that really, those enabling moments that helped you change the perception of the way this work was done to being a locally led from an outside funded or an outside supported, So I think those are sort of challenges that we all go over in this region. So it might be something that I'd like to hear from you later, Tanzil. So thanks very much for that talk. And now to move on our webinar, we have interesting case study and experiences from Dr. Lila Nath Sharma, who leads the Biodiversity and Restoration Program in the organization ForestAction Group. And he's from Nepal, and Lila will speak to us about his experiences with policy engagement, especially in influencing and getting things off the ground for locally led restoration. Lila, it's over to you now, and I hope you try to stay within the 15 minutes, and I will try not to interrupt you. So over to you, Lila.
So thank you, Anita, very much. It's good to see you all today. I'm very sorry that my camera is not working. I tried, but it did not work. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share our project's work. Today, I will be talking about how we are trying to change dominant narratives in forest restoration sector in Nepal. So So when we talk about restoration in Nepal, I think we have to see backward in terms of degradation context and restoration interventions. So Nepal faced environmental degradation since long, but it is said that it was in peak sometimes during mid of the last century. So there was a widespread concern about deforestation, forest degradation, its the long-term environmental impact during the 1960s and 70s. And a lot of scholars and development workers have written about environmental degradation of that time. So our government and development partners have responded to the degradation problem of that time. So in the two major strategies were adopted to respond the degradation problem in Nepal. So first one was Nepal started protecting some areas as protected areas, and Nepal also adopted participatory forestry. And participatory forestry started sometime during late 70s, and it proliferated after 1990s. Uh, so because of our response, there has been substantial increase in forest cover. During 1990, it was 29%, and in 2010 to 15, our forest cover was 40%. And we have protected almost a quarter of country's area. And similarly, community forestry program is a major and flagship program of forest management. And currently there are over 23,000 community forest user groups managing nearly 2.4 million hectares of forest. And another change we have seen is that megafauna population, especially tiger and rhino population, increased between 2009 and 2022. Our tiger population nearly tripled. So there is a lot of progress in terms of restoration, but there are still some problem, and we can see degradation is there. It may be in different form compared to what we have earlier. So we can see in the photo also there a forest is engulfed by invasive species, and we have evidence that invasive species number as well as their abundance has been increasing in recent decades. That is one problem. And in last decade, we noticed a lot of fire incidences. So fire is increasing in both in terms of its frequency and magnitude. And forest stands, which are a kind of restored forest, they are kind of homogeneous stand. And so forest quality has been compromised in restored forest. And although we are gaining forest in general, but there are localized cases of forest loss. So in this context, we have started our REDAA project. So in our REDAA project, we want to improve forest landscape restoration through informed decision. Currently, the restoration decision is not that much backed by scientific evidences. And another, we are working in restoration, but we don't have a kind of guiding framework and strategies for local or place-based restoration, and we will do that. And we also work to enhance capacity of our diverse stakeholders because restoration is a kind of multi-stakeholder field, and we want to contribute in capacity building of these stakeholders across different level of governance. And projects major activities include outcome analysis of past restoration intervention, as we have done a lot of restoration intervention throughout the country. And we will do national level survey and bring evidences of what has worked in the past and what has not worked. And another is that we will organize several capacity enhancement activities for different stakeholders and practitioners. And we will work with policy level stakeholders. We will organize dialogues and workshop with them. And we will also form network of restoration practitioners working in Nepal. And based on our research, we will produce knowledge product targeting different audiences, and we will communicate that product with different audiences. So our project will adopt a collaborative approach in terms of knowledge production. We will work with local communities, indigenous people, and so it is we adopt a kind of co-production approach, and we will have nature-based solution approach, and we will be inclusive in our project implementation, and we will promote for inclusive restoration. So when it comes to power in restoration, power and policies in restoration, there are certain dominant narratives in our forest management and restoration projects. And these narratives are actually the driver of restoration interventions. And so we want to challenge these dominant narratives. So I like to share some of the dominant narratives here. First, one is about uh, in our restoration design and restoration discourses, there is always forest cover on top. So we are saying that, okay, we have increased our forest cover is this much. So there is a lot of priority in forest ecosystem, and that the narrative promotes certain kinds of interventions. So currently, so all restoration interventions try to increase forest cover, irrespective of the type of the ecosystem. And so when you prioritize trees and forest as a main restoration target, then open ecosystems in cultural landscapes, for example, like grasslands and open wooded land, they are not adequately considered in restoration. And we are just talking about forest cover, canopy cover, and tree density. And so there is less focus on the quality of forest stand, how it is composed, how diverse is it. Such kind of things are not considered in restoration intervention. In this context, so we prioritize that deliberate and informed policy approaches, and so that we try to um, engage stakeholders in design of restoration project that considers overall ecosystem health. And another is that currently forests are mainly managed for timber, although we talk about multi-purpose forestry, but the sole focus is on timber and trees. So we will promote multiple values and multiple services of forest ecosystem. So another narrative is that we are focusing on end product of restoration, that is forest. So in this narrative, what we want to highlight is that along with in product of restoration or outcome of restoration, we need to think about input of restoration as well. So if we do not consider the process, approaches, and strategies, then it will have social cost. For example, during the past restoration, we had a lot of social cost in different parts of the country. Many indigenous people were evicted during the establishment of protected areas. So, and when we think about only in product or outcome of restoration, that is forest, for example, and we are not thinking about what kind of forest, how to make forest. So that's why in our natural forest, where we have tremendous natural regeneration production, and we are introducing a lot of exotic plant species which may be invasive in future, we don't know. So in this context, we prioritize inclusive restoration, and we argue that inclusion is not a choice, but it should be mandatory in restoration projects. So marginalized people and indigenous people should be included in restoration activities. And another is that, so I already mentioned that we have nearly a quarter of land protected. Okay, you have this bulk of land, chunk of land is protected, then rest of the land should be managed for production purpose. And that narratives prioritizes megafauna conservation. And it is not that biodiversity exists only in the protected area. And we have emerging evidences. We saw that substantial biodiversity, including endemic species and threatened species, species of global conservation priority, exist outside protected area. So, and when we talk only about a protected area and biodiversity in certain area, then that will exclude traditional ecological knowledge, because it exists where people interact with the forest and ecosystem. So such kind of interaction is undermined in past restoration activities. So in this case, we prioritize place-based and locally designed management action for sustainable restoration. And we will work to reduce trade-off in conservation and ecosystem service. So we will work to enhance synergies. And now currently the biodiversity conservation approaches are very singular type. And so we promote and embrace pluralistic approaches for biodiversity conservation. So I will talk about how we work to challenge the dominant narrative. So we have the three key areas of work.
Lila, you have about 2 minutes.
Okay, so through co-production of knowledge, through capacity enhancement, and through policy dialogue, we want to challenge dominant narratives. And when dominant narratives are challenged, then dominant actors, they reflect on their strategies and approaches. And through these actions and through change narratives, we will inform policies. And these policies will be place-based, and these policies will promote diverse restoration strategies. So here I like to share some insight and some challenges in future. So what we have seen during the last 1 year's project implementation is that past restoration interventions are generally top-down and techno-bureaucratic in design and implementation. And in the past restoration interventions, open ecosystems in cultural landscapes are grossly ignored. We have completed recent survey in some of the open ecosystems. And when we started restoration some 40, 30 years back, and there were a lot of economic promises, and people are not getting benefit what they were promised in the beginning. So people are not getting benefit from the restored forest. Benefit means I want to say the economic benefit. And so externally designed institutions and technologies were imposed during restoration, and these have marginalized traditional knowledge and customary institutions. Although we have community forestry, and there is a debate about how much indigenous is this community forestry program. So another issue is that human wildlife conflict has been increased in different parts of the country. These are some insight. And now I like to say some of the challenges. So there exists a kind of mindset that is conventional mindset in so our ecosystem management sector and conservation sector. So there is megafauna and forest as trees. So these kind of thinking is there, and that is one challenge. And recently we adopted federal system of governance. So we have three tiers of government, and the ecosystem governance is shared among these three layers of government. So ecosystem governance is in a way fragmented, so that hinders policy uptake. That is another challenge. And so we are facing rural outmigration of especially youth people. They are moving to different parts of the world, and within country they are moving to city area. That is another challenge in restoration. And so we have a 45% forest cover in country. So then people, this has marks the quality dimension and social issues in forest restoration project. Having saying this, I like to conclude my talk. Thank you very much for your patience.
Yes. Thanks so much, Lila. Thanks. I saw you running through the last bit. Sorry to put you on the spot like that, but so what I have is I have a bit of good news. We've had actually no responses from the audience to our question, which means we have more time for Q&A, and that means that all of these last bits that you rushed through is we have time to discuss this. And so I want to really jump into the Q&A and the discussion part of it. We'll take about a little more than 15 minutes to do to sort of summarize and talk about some of the key issues in our area. And so there's a whole bunch of questions in the chat box and in the Q&A section, and I'm going to pick and choose so that we can stay within time. But I also encourage the speakers that because there are some that are directed to you, so if you want to respond, can they respond in the chat to those questions? So, we can do that if it's possible. And but right now, I wanted to just circle back to this question that I had even in the beginning to you, Tanzil, that how do we really get this to be locally owned when actually it's the support from outside and the funding and all of that helped us catalyze the effort? How do we really do this? And we may all have experiences that we can share about this. Lila, feel free to also add your comments to this point.
I mean, it's difficult to come up with really, good answers because these are complicated questions. And I think I was just thinking about something that James, if you see the chat, he raised this point about disinterested, powerful, people who are not interested in recognizing that their ownership or domination of nature prevents its better use and stewardship by others. The reason that I put, that I bring that into this idea of locally led is because because what is local is really relational. It's not an absolute. So what looks like local from, sitting in London when you are talking about a country like Bangladesh, talking about the local, a lot of different factors are packed into the local. But the moment you are there, the local sort of explodes into all these different layers in which, really some people are not local, let's say they run a global business sitting in there, not interested in really what happens to the lake next to them because it's of little consequence to them. The reason, again, I think, therefore, this recognition of translocality that, is quite important. This idea that, and then so this plurality of the local. So I'd say translocality and the pluralness of locality. These two things are absolutely important because the way that we craft often sort of instruments and policy, because it valorizes local, let's say, without unpacking this, a lot of the times people will sort of use this term as a way to legitimate even disingenuous interests, because that's what we're trying to really battle. Because even within the settlement, we see that there are some people they have already caught on that before they used to represent them as community leaders. Now they say they're they're spearheading locally led activity because they now keep hearing this from us, from NGOs. So for me, understanding the local politics from the ground reality and then operationalizing, not to nullify it, but in tandem, sort of like in a way that you are responsive to these nuances. For me, this is crucial because at the end of the day, the power dynamics always sort of like some people get excluded. So how do you really find this who are marginalized even within a locally led management system? That is sort of like for us the most challenging bit of how to get to that very edge of the locally led spectrum.
Yeah. And I think there could be a possibility when you've mapped, for instance, there's also several locally, like you've done in your whole power dynamics chart, when you've mapped all the role players, but they all have different sets of power. They have different, they sit. So I think in your work, the locally led, marginalized, the locally powerful, the more locally affluent. It's the power play that I think makes it still an uneven playing ground, even though we try to include everyone, right?
Yes.
And that's something that's a challenge in the areas that we're working. And I wonder how Lila thinks about that in his situation. Like, how much buy-in is there from already existing local bodies into your idea of restoration or locally led restoration? Lila, are you there? Are you able to hear us?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. Yeah, I have seen some very interesting questions in the question answer section. So thank you, Anita, for this. So currently, still we have a kind of techno-bureaucratic dominance in restoration and conservation policies. Although we are talking a lot about inclusive and local or community level conservation type of things. So now we have opportunities for locally led restoration projects, or we have opportunity to enhance local stake in conservation and restoration, because now Nepal's this federal system of governance has provided a lot of political legitimacy and economic authority for local governments. And we have 753 local governments, and these entities are very powerful, and they can work with provincial government and in making locally led restoration. And now there, with local government, there are a lot of resources to work with communities. So I see when we work with local government, and if we facilitate a dialogue between provincial government and local government, there is opportunity for local level restoration.
So when again, the whole aspect of people with power and people with knowledge, and often now what we're seeing in our situation is that knowledge is not leading to power. So, for instance, when we're talking about indigenous people or indigenous communities, we talk about the knowledge, the TEK that they have, which should go into informing restoration policy. But we know that because the power isn't there, that's not going to happen. And we can be acting, we have a big role to play there in including that local knowledge. Whereas in the case of what Tanzil brought up, where there are communities who have influence and power, but they don't necessarily have the knowledge in the system. So, how are we pushing those boundaries in the work that we do in our projects is something that I thought can also address some of the questions that are being asked there about good restoration policy, inclusion of knowledge and power. Would any of you like to start on that? I know you're busy typing in answers. Several roles that we're playing here right now.
So I think now we are gradually, there is a debate, already there is a debate about that traditional management tools or local people's knowledge has important contribution in restoration and conservation. Actually, there is, but people gradually started recognizing this. For example, and what we are doing to include traditional ecological knowledge and local knowledge in restoration is that we are working with local communities in their capacity enhancement, and we are also working with authorities to bring the local knowledge in restoration. For example, now people have seen that when grasslands were restored, a lot of valuable medicinal herbs were lost from locally. It's not a kind of global thing. It's at local level, several species of valuable herbs were lost. And now local people are looking for that. And we removed traditional management, which people were doing voluntarily. And now state has invested in that kind of management. For example, in the past, of course, our climate change is there to enhance our forest fire. In the past, local people used to bring a lot of leaf litter from the forest that used to control forest fire. And when we banned grazing in the forest and products collection was regulated, then local people also stopped collecting leaf litter, and that has consequences in the fire. So there is a debate about such kind of things, and with more debate and dialogue and capacity enhancement activities, I think these things will be included.
Yeah, yeah. Tanzil, if you don't have any thoughts to that one, that question about, including local knowledge and the knowledge power dynamics, yeah, would you
I
like to,
do
please?
have one. Yeah. So for example,
Please.
I mean, this is something again, sort of like, that plurality of the local. So for example, no one in Dhaka has ever thought of having floating infrastructure on the lake to further, like, phytoremediate and all that. Even though this is actually quite a common local knowledge in the southern part of Bangladesh. So for our project, we actually brought us specialists, indigenous specialists who have been, building this local, this floating islands uh, for vegetation. They were never really seen from Dhaka as that knowledge had any value, because they thought this is like a rural thing. This is, this floating things that can only happen in villages. So this idea of the local indigenous knowledge being valuable to a global city like Dhaka, that Dhaka wants to be the global, like the next Singapore, they never thought. So they never thought of that knowledge as something having intrinsic value. And this is a sort of like the way that power gets played in a center periphery relationship. So that, the indigenous knowledge that sits often at this periphery is held by local indigenous communities who are not part of the urban elite. Their knowledge is never seen good enough for restoring, or or doing, like, large scale projects in the center of the city. This is another realization that, the local can be so spread. Like, how do we then make this translocal movements? So the moment that we brought this indigenous guy from the rural area as an expert, suddenly everyone is interested, because they're like, oh, because if he's like an expert that is funded by UK FCDO, and University of Sheffield is there, he must be good. But these guys are already there making these floating things, all their life. But no one thought that that was good enough for being here. So again, that's again a story, but I think it just shows you how power dynamics impact the way that you value some knowledges and you don't value some knowledges, and how to counter that, I think, is crucial in all projects.
Yeah. Yeah, that's important, because that also then sort of addresses this question that James has put in the Q&A, which is about good restoration policy, and how can that ever be strong enough to avoid being overridden by more powerful policies, such as economic policies. And to that, I would also refer to this, like, very often indigenous knowledge-shaped solutions or nature-based solutions mean very little. Nobody can make much money off it. There's not a lot of infrastructure involved, and there's no contracts involved. It could be reasons like that. It sometimes, when you just use technologies or knowledge like that, it really doesn't bring necessarily large projects, right? Do you think that could be a disincentive for having knowledge or included in good policy?
I mean,
Right.
I think if I'm answering that, to be honest, I think we might need to sort of like move beyond the way that we speak about things. Because like I was actually answering to James, who had a question about how could good restoration policy ever be strong enough to avoid being overridden by more powerful policies such as economic policies. And I'll just answer this live now. Because maybe it's about moving beyond this binary of choose nature or choose economy. Because in countries that are like developing countries, quote unquote developing, it's such a difficult argument, because that's what the big argument has always been. You need to develop first, you can fix the nature later. So you do fill up the wetlands, build the city, don't worry about it. This is all collateral damage, this is all, and almost like nature is fixable, but you need to grow the economy first, because vote banks are tied with it. The GDP, World Bank loans, all of it is tied with it. I think we need to sort of like put it on top of its head. So at least that's what we're doing. So for example, we are saying if you restore the wetland in Dhaka, you're gonna have, actually we calculated the total ecosystem value in 20 years time. It's actually 20 billion pounds. And we said, but if you let this die, actually your increase is only gonna be 10 billion in terms of real estate. And we're saying, but if you fix it, it's actually an economic argument. So it's making the economic argument, bring it to the fore, and we're saying, all I'm saying is sort of like, again, moving beyond that binary between, because it's not one or the other. And how do you work with actors where the expectation is to speak in those terms? So I think it's all about sort of innovating a new language in which to move that policy space towards a more inclusive, and then cross-cutting. Maybe cross-cutting is a good word, like a cross-cutting way of these silos that has been set up. So yeah, that'd be my answer.
Yeah. And I think somewhere at the heart of it, if I may also add some of my response, is, it's also a question of who owns those public resources, and, this aspect that the state will look after it. The state is in charge of it. It's the state's issues. I think there has to be some kind of opening up of that platform for more people, and more agency for participation, that will probably get us to more sustainable restoration policies. Because at the end of the day, it becomes like a piece of land or a water body that also nobody owns and owns up to, is some of the issues that we've seen in managing these landscapes or waterscapes. So I don't know if we want to. We thought we had a lot of time, but we've actually come to the end of our Q&A time. And I thought I would ask if Janine and Francesca want to take over from us and go ahead to that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anita. We're 4 minutes before the end of the webinar, so it's a good time to pause and to thank you three for joining us today. Anita, for expertly leading this conversation. It's been a privilege to listen to you all. Just for those who are attending, if you would like to get in touch with any of the speakers, their details are now shown on the screen. So please do feel free to reach out to continue a conversation, to ask for further resources. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share with you the recording from this webinar, as well as any outputs that we create together following on. And as I said at the start, you can join our community by joining our newsletter, and that's where you'll learn more about opportunities to connect with the many experts that were within this community, such as Anita, Tanzil, and Lila. If we could just, before you leave us, before you flee, if you could just respond to a poll question for us, and I hope Matt will be able to launch it now. It's very simple. It'll take you 1 minute. It would just be really helpful for us all on the call here today, including Anita, Tanzil, and Lila, to just understand to what extent did this session today provide valuable ideas, approaches, or learning on locally led nature restoration. Once we've heard from you all, we'll go to a close and we'll feature REDAA's contact information. So if anyone would like to contact us directly, you'll have those details there. But again, once again, just whilst you're filling in that poll, thank you very much for attending today. Yes, and here's our details, so you can contact REDAA, you can find out more about REDAA, you can also join the community from our website. If there is anything, as we say, please do get in contact, and please do, before you leave, give us an answer to that poll. It would be very helpful when we come to creating more online events like these in the future together with the community. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.